My brother-in-law, who is married to my sister, confessed to my wife that he was in love with her. This led to a series of devastating revelations in our family. Yesterday, out of nowhere, my brother-in-law invited my wife to lunch, saying he needed to talk to her about something. When my wife told me about the invitation, she seemed puzzled, but not overly worried. "Do you think it's about my sister?" she asked, furrowing her brow. "Maybe they're having problems, and he wants a woman's perspective." I found the whole thing strange. My brother-in-law had never reached out to my wife like this before, though he frequently messaged her and other family members for trivial matters. So I didn't think much of it. After all, we were a close family, and it wasn't uncommon for us to support one another through tough times. "Go find out," I said, shrugging off my initial unease. My wife agreed, deciding to meet him at a cafe near her office the next day. The next morning, as she was preparing for work, she mentioned lunch again. "I'm still not sure what this is about," she said, a hint of concern in her voice. I reassured her, telling her it was probably nothing serious. "Just listen to what he has to say, and if it's something we need to help with, we'll figure it out together." The cafe was busy, full of the usual lunchtime crowd, which helped her feel at ease. She arrived a little early and found a table by the window so she could keep an eye on the entrance. He arrived a few minutes later, looking more nervous than she had ever seen him. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, talking about work and the kids for a while, but once their food arrived, he took a deep breath and got to the heart of what he had come to say. He started by complimenting her, telling her how beautiful she looked. At first, she thought he was just being polite, but then he kept going. He told her how she had always been the light in his life, how she made him feel things he'd never felt before. "It was love at first sight," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I've loved you since the moment I first saw you. If you were mine, I'd treat you like a queen. I'd give you everything you deserve." My wife was stunned. She stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. This man, my brother-in-law, married to my sister, and father of their 2 kids, was pouring his heart out to her. He laid it on thick, making grand promises about how different life would be if they were together. He went on, saying how he had been holding these feelings in for years, how he'd watched her and admired her from a distance, growing more and more convinced that they were meant to be together. She tried to interrupt, to tell him he was making a huge mistake, but he continued speaking over her, as if he had rehearsed this speech countless times in his head. Keep in mind, this man had always had a friendly relationship with my wife. Our family sees each other often, being close-knit, and he was always the fun uncle to our kids, the guy who showed up at every family barbecue and holiday dinner. He texts my wife frequently, but it was always about mundane things, like the kids' schedules and family events. Nothing sexual, nothing that would raise any red flags. In fact, he texts and calls my mom too, and they have a friendly rapport. None of us ever thought anything of it. To us, he was always just a good guy, someone we trusted implicitly. So when my wife recounted this to me, it felt like a punch to the gut. She didn't let him finish. She stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked out. She's shaking as she calls me, telling me everything that just happened. While she's on the phone, his texts start. First, it's apologies, he didn't mean it. He thinks it's only infatuation. He's sorry for making her uncomfortable, but the damage is done. She leaves work early to come home and talk to me about this, her phone buzzing non-stop with his calls and messages. I tell her to answer one of his calls, put him on speaker so I can hear. He's crying, begging her not to tell my sister. He keeps saying it was a mistake, that he misread signals, that he thought she felt the same way. Apparently, when we were together this past weekend, he thought my wife was flirting with him, that they had a moment alone in our kitchen where he felt a connection. My wife is a major ballbuster, and I guess I can see how that could be taken as flirting, but this is beyond anything we could have imagined. He asks if she told me, and I answer yes, as I'm on speaker. Then he starts begging me to, pleading for us to keep this a secret. This went on for a while, him begging and us listening. My main question was whether he had cheated on my sister before. He swore he hadn't, swearing on his kids' lives that it was just my wife. He said I should understand. It was her, only her. At that point, I was done listening. I told him I wasn't going to do anything tonight and that I'd call him tomorrow. Now, we're left with this mess, not knowing what to do next. My wife says we should drive over there right now and tell my sister, but the idea of wrecking my sister's family is killing me. Thinking about what this will do to my nieces makes me want to vomit. I know the right thing to do is to tell my sister, but I'm also thinking about my wife. It's not her fault, but there's sure to be resentment from my family. Even if my sister doesn't divorce him and they reconcile, I can't see how we'll ever be together again like we were before, if at all. This whole episode could tear my family apart. I don't give a damn about him. He tried to destroy my family, but I do care about everyone else. Update. So, everyone who told me last night that I couldn't wait to tell my sister was right. A little after 12, I got a call from my sister. She sounded upset and said she had to tell me something. My heart sank as she explained that her husband, my brother-in-law, had come to her in tears, claiming my wife had tried to start an affair with him. He spun a tale where my wife was the instigator, tried to shift the blame entirely onto her. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I immediately told my sister that wasn't the case and assured her I would be right over. This situation needed to be addressed face to face, not over the phone. I hung up, and with urgency, I called my parents. I woke them up, explaining what was happening in quick, clipped sentences. My father was furious. My mother sounded shocked, but resolute. They agreed to head over to my sister's house to sit with her kids, offering the support she would desperately need right now. Next, I called my younger brother. He groggily answered, confusion turning to alarm as I filled him in. He promised to come over to our place and stay with our kids, ensuring they wouldn't be left alone during this turmoil. His calm, steady presence would be a comfort to them. Meanwhile, my wife was already gathering her things, her face pale and drawn. She was dreading the confrontation, but knew it was necessary. We left the house in a hurry, the drive to my sister's place feeling longer than it actually was. The silence in the car was heavy, both of us lost in our thoughts. When we arrived, the scene was even more tense than I had imagined. My sister was out on the front porch with my brother-in-law. When we got there, he looked beat, eyes downcast, his posture slumped in defeat. He knew we had the texts and voicemails, the undeniable proof of his betrayal. I really don't know what he was hoping to accomplish by calling my sister in the middle of the night with his lies. Maybe he thought he could get ahead of the story, twist the narrative to save himself, but it was a futile effort. As we walked up to them, the tension in the air was palpable. My wife was trembling, her face a mask of controlled anger and hurt. She handed my sister her phone without a word. My sister took it, her hand steady, but her eyes burning with a mix of fury and pain. She scrolled through the texts, her expression hardening with each one she read. Then, she listened to the voicemails, the damning evidence of his declarations and her refusals. Before she could say anything, her brother-in-law started sobbing. This is a man who runs into burning buildings, who faces danger daily without flinching. Seeing him like this, broken and vulnerable, is jarring. His cries are deep and guttural, raw with regret and fear. It's a scene that's almost surreal, a big, tough firefighter brought to his knees by his own actions. My sister's face remains impassive, a mask of stern resolve. She's always been tough, but right now, she's unyielding. She waits for him to finish. Her silence is more powerful than any words. When he finally quiets down, still hiccuping with the remnants of his sobs, she speaks. "Pack a bag and go," she says, her voice cold and clear. "I can't stand to look at you." He tries to argue, to plead his case, but she's having none of it. "Stop it," she snaps, cutting through his words. "There's nothing you can say that will make this better." She turns away from him, walks over to my wife, and pulls her into a hug. It's a moment of solidarity between them, a small comfort in the middle of this nightmare. They've been friends since college, and the strength of their bond is evident. It's a relief to see that, despite everything, they're standing together. This leaves me standing with my brother-in-law. He's a wreck, his face red and swollen from crying, his shoulders slumped. He looks at me, his eyes pleading for some kind of understanding or forgiveness, but I have none to offer. He tries to speak, his voice cracking, but I cut him off. You need to leave, I say firmly. This is your mess. You need to deal with the consequences. He nods, defeated, and slowly makes his way inside to pack his things. My sister stays with my wife, the two of them talking quietly, leaning on each other for support. The rest of the night is a blur of conversations and plans. We all rally around my sister, helping her figure out what to do next, how to protect her kids from the fallout. My sister begins questioning my wife, trying to understand why her husband thought any of this could possibly work out. He must have had some reason to believe she reciprocated his feelings. My sister insists that there hadn't been any issues in their marriage. Everything had been normal. My wife is crying at this point, tears streaming down her face as she tries to make sense of the situation. There's nothing you haven't seen, she says, her voice shaking. She hands my sister her phone again, and together, they painstakingly go through every text message sent over the past 2 years. They read each one carefully, looking for any hint of inappropriate behavior, but there's nothing there. My wife was just being herself. She has a playful personality, always joking around and teasing. It's part of what makes her so lovable and approachable. My brother-in-law has a similar sense of humor, and they've always teased each other in a light-hearted, harmless way. She does the same with my mom and my younger brother. It's simply how she connects with people. The only instance my wife can think of that might have been misunderstood happened just this past weekend. She reflects on it, trying to figure out where things went wrong. We were all at our house, and she and my brother-in-law reached for the fridge simultaneously. They playfully jostled for who would get there first, laughing in the process. He let her win, but then he reached around her waist to grab a beer, moving his hand slowly. She admits that in that moment, the way he did it felt slightly inappropriate. It was a brief feeling, and she pushed it aside, not wanting to make a big deal of it. She now wonders if her silence gave him some false hope. My sister listens, her expression softening. She doesn't blame my wife for any of this. She knows her well enough to understand that her playful nature isn't an open invitation for anything more. It's not your fault, she reassures her, and my wife nods, though guilt still lingers. As they finish reading the messages, it becomes clear that there was never any mutual attraction, no secret flirtations. My wife was simply being herself, and my brother-in-law twisted that into something it wasn't. The realization that this misunderstanding has caused so much pain is almost unbearable. But at least for now, a sister's faith in my wife remains intact. Then, my sister begins searching through his MacBook to uncover what else she might not know. Her anger is palpable, and her hands shake as she types. After several attempts, she guesses the password correctly. Taking a deep breath, she starts going through his files, looking for anything that might shed more light on the situation. It doesn't take long before she finds something disturbing. Hidden in a folder, innocuously titled, are numerous pictures of my wife. They span years. And what's most unsettling is that they're all isolated shots, just her. Never in group settings or candid family moments. My sister clicks through the photos, her anger morphing into cold, creeping horror. One set stands out. A few years ago, we went on a couple's trip to the Caribbean. It was a rare vacation without the kids, and my wife, feeling more relaxed in the adults-only setting, wore something more revealing. My sister wonders aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, has this crossed into restraining order territory? Things have taken an unsettling turn, far beyond what any of us could have imagined. The line between inappropriate and disturbing has been crossed. She calls us over to show us the photos. My wife gasps, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. She had no idea he was doing this, no inkling of his obsession. My sister, now angered, but tempered with a deep sense of betrayal, starts considering next steps. Legal action, protection, everything. The full truth is coming out, and my wife will be directly involved to ensure there are no lies or half-truths. They set up a FaceTime call with my wife, and I listen in off camera, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and dread. My sister, ever meticulous, records the entire conversation for good measure. As the call starts, the tension is thick. My brother-in-law looks worn out, his eyes swollen and red from crying. He speaks hesitantly, his voice shaky, but as he continues, the truth slowly emerges. He describes what he thought was an innocent crush, one he thought he could dismiss. But over time, as he spent more time around her, he realized it was something deeper. He became fixated on her personality, her laughter, the way she interacted with everyone. He explains how he found himself watching her, captivated by her presence, even when she was just being herself, playful and kind. He admits he tried to suppress these feelings, convincing himself they were harmless. But his obsession only grew stronger over time. My wife and sister are visibly shaken as they hear how long this has been going on and how deep his obsession ran. It's almost too much for them to process. When he finishes, a heavy silence fills the room. My sister speaks, her voice icy and controlled. "What made you think my wife would leave me for you?" she asks, her eyes piercing through him. He stammers, struggling for the right words. He mentions the supposed mutual attraction, moments he misinterpreted as signs of her reciprocation. My wife and sister erupt with anger, frustration building with every word he speaks. This entire ordeal had become a twisted fantasy of my brother-in-law's, an unhealthy delusion that nearly ripped our family apart. The tension that had been building up during the call finally erupted into a storm of shouting and cussing. My wife's voice was a mix of fury and hurt, while my sister's tone was steely and unforgiving. The emotional barrage was overwhelming, the air thick with betrayal and disbelief. The phone call abruptly ended when my wife, shaking and distraught, stood in front of me. She gave me a teasing smile, asking if I liked what I saw. But then her expression hardened, turning serious and almost cold. "Never again," she said, her tone firm and final. "Once trust is broken, it's almost impossible to rebuild," she added, and I knew she meant every word. My wife is fiercely protective of the trust we've built, and once it's gone, it's almost never regained. As I sat there, replaying the chaotic scene in my mind, I couldn't help but reflect on my brother-in-law. I knew he was cocky, self-assured, but this was something entirely different. His dangerous fixation on my wife had spiraled into madness, and I wondered how he thought this would end. My sister was taking steps to protect her children, to limit his exposure to them. She wanted to ensure they were shielded from the mess he had created. "As far as I'm concerned, he's detached from reality," she said, her voice cold with resolve. Her concern was no longer about salvaging her marriage, but about keeping her kids safe and maintaining stability for them. My brother-in-law returned home yesterday, not because my sister wanted him back, but because legally, he had no other choice. There's a good chance she will be granted full custody of the kids. The texts, voicemails, and the disturbing cache of photos all paint a clear picture of his obsession and instability. He doesn't seem to even want to fight her on it, as if he knows he's lost everything and is too exhausted to put up any resistance. My sister will be fine. She's stronger than she looks, and any love she had for him is gone. She moves through the house with a determined focus, her attention solely on her children. They're accustomed to their routine, but things are about to change. The stability of their home, the presence of both parents, even if fractured, will no longer be there, and it's certain to be hard on them once they fully understand what's happening. My sister is prepared for this. She's already consulted with a child psychologist to help her kids navigate the inevitable questions and emotions that will arise. She's ready to be both mother and father to them, to give them the love and support they'll need to get through this. As for my brother-in-law, he's staying in the guest room, a silent figure in the house, no longer welcome in the family's circle. My wife, determined to protect herself, blocked his number, trying to create the distance he so desperately needed. But that night, he sent her an email from a different account, a desperate attempt to reach out that felt both pathetic and unsettling. He had just made it, starting with what seemed like a sincere apology, but it quickly spiraled into something much darker. He began by saying he never got to finish what he'd started at the restaurant that day, implying there was more he needed to confess. Then, he launched into a disturbing revelation. He had always felt he was misinterpreting things, mistaking her friendly, playful nature for something deeper. He painted a picture of a connection that existed only in his mind, a fantasy he had convinced himself was real. The email took an even more unsettling turn as it veered into a large section about me. Let's just say, I didn't realize he had such a low opinion of me. He was convinced I wasn't satisfying my wife properly, criticizing everything from my appearance to my demeanor, suggesting I was somehow unworthy of her. His warped state of mind became even clearer, another piece of the puzzle showing just how far gone he was. This email mix of apology, obsession, and vitriol, which might just be enough to get him permanently removed from the house. For now, my wife and I are taking it one day at a time. The support from our friends and family has been invaluable, helping us navigate this surreal and painful situation. My wife isn't doing great, but she's improving every day. She does feel guilty at times for being too comfortable around him, for unknowingly feeding into his delusion. Yet, as difficult as this is, we are both committed to moving forward, rebuilding trust and safety. Our primary concern throughout this ordeal has always been my sister and her children. The impact of my brother-in-law's actions on their lives is immeasurable. Ensuring their protection and emotional well-being has become our top priority. Children, especially, need to be shielded from such toxic situations to maintain their sense of security and normalcy. When faced with something like this, it's essential to act quickly and decisively. We didn't hesitate to gather evidence, confront the issue head-on, and involve legal counsel to ensure they were protected.